So I'm a little nervous because I've not tried a presentation quite like this before, and I haven't spoken about Gebser before. So the two of those combined, I think, increase the risk that I feel. What I'm trying to do today, or the way I composed my presentation, is using the technique that I'm going to talk about, or using some of the techniques I'm going to talk about. So it's intended to be more performative, more inactive through the writing, much like with projective verse. And I've given you a supplemental handout that shows the other kind of unique component of my presentation, which is I'm a writing teacher, and writing is an interesting discipline in that it tends to come from a place of praxis. So theory in action or theory applied. And so I'm kind of trying to presence that part of my discipline and interest in moving into experimental writing in my program in Europa, and come together with a presentation that you'll also find valuable in connection to Gebser. So, the word assaying found its way into my title, and I wasn't really sure how it got there, and I began to question it and thought, well, surely it had a purpose for being there. It wouldn't have just presented itself with no reason. But it didn't seem to want to reveal it, really, until maybe yesterday, when I spent a little time with it etymologically, and came to the sense that assay really has a couple of meanings from its root, one being actually the French essayer, which means to try, endeavor, strive, or to test the quality of. It also has the sense of trial, and we've talked here meaningfully about measurement in Gebser in the sense of assay that has measurement involved, I think is the playful sense. So kind of playing with the idea of those multiple senses of the word as I go forward, rather than just getting rid of it altogether, since it did seem to have an opinion that it wanted to be there. So I want to start with the sense of a labyrinthine composing process. How many of you have consciously tried to, and I'd like to see a show of hands here, to write hermeneutically, or to write in a sense of like using Gnostic techniques, open to the intuition, really going where it wants to go? Okay, so I'm not alone. And the way I experienced that process, part of my interest in writing processes is what it models for us. What I'm really interested about that process is the way that it progresses through iterations. So just like, kind of like walking the labyrinth. And it comes together, and the coming together is actually a revelation that is more than it would have been. And so I like the metaphor here of the labyrinth that is really inspired by Nietzsche, who described it as the architecture of the soul. And then Bachelard adds that the walls of the labyrinth are soft, as if lined in imagination. But there are dangers of being in a labyrinth. We have the isolation, the potentially going astray, or the being consumed by the Minotaur. And then one more nuance from Nietzsche is that in the labyrinth, we're not actually seeking the truth, we're seeking Ariadne. So to presence where the project came from for me, this passage from Ever-Present Origin, page 309, every etiologene is a volition, and as such is valid only when it allows origin to become transparent in the present. To do this, it must be formulated in such a way as to be free of ego. And this means not just free of subject, but also free of object. Only then does it sustain the verity of the whole. This has nothing to do with representation. Only in philosophical thought can the world be represented. For the integral perception of the truth, the world is pure statement and thus volition. So I had a lot of interest in what world statement might mean here and what it might enact. Really what shined through that statement to me, the world statement, is the sense of the kind of writing I want to talk about today, primarily, the examples I'm going to pull from are from George Quash's work, where he's done some work with performative or axial poetics. And so I was looking for types of writing, and this has been an interest of mine for a while, that actually do something through the force of the language, not just Searle's speech acts, which if you said, I promise you, you actually have the force of a promise enacted through the words. I'm looking for something slightly more sourced through the consciousness of the writer than that. More like the Zen pointing out instruction that essentially, has transmission kind of behind it. So some of my goals for today, I'm hoping that I can lead us into a place of a poetics of praxis, where you experience it in your own person, body, and awareness by entering the labyrinth of meaning. To do this, one of my argumentative points for really experiencing the world statement is the body-mind integration moment. And I'll say a little bit more about where this comes from, and specifically a recent Wilbur influence and a nuance on that with Gebser. I'd like you to consider your own ontopoetics. So this is kind of in the tradition of Heidegger, but specifically Freya Matthews has used the term ontopoetics. And so I'd like you to engage the conversation of your own ontopoetics. And Quasha has argued that there's a performative indicative in language. And so I'm arguing this might be a new type of tense for integral consciousness. He also argues about principle-driven art as being somehow different from concept-based art. And I propose a grammar of the world statement. Sorry, a little energy rush, just kind of letting it move through. And then also the modalities of a few prominent mystical writing traditions I want to dive into in order to surface some of these technologies as they've been applied and really kind of just recover the value of those. So the body-mind integration moment is something that Rob McNamara explained pretty well and thoroughly in Strength to Awaken, which is a book on bodybuilding for consciousness development. It's well done though, and it describes the boundaries of the ego in that moment of overcoming resistance. And I'm really interested in embodied writing, and so that's where that comes in. And then also from Chris Dierke's ITC presentation this year, he offers an argument about Ken Wilber and the centauric structure, which Wilber articulated in a symbolic mode up until about the fifth, like what they call Wilber 5. And so it's significant for several reasons, but one of them is that it involves that body-mind integration that I'm talking about as a Gnostic sense, essentially, that you can work with in your own healing process. We see it in such shamanic work like Arnold Mendel's notion of the flirts in the dream time, the things that arise, and I would say that this is probably one way to look at this diaphaneity conversation, or if there's a conversation and how this integrates, the magic, the mythic, and the mental. So I'm saying that it's worth looking into, and here are Dierke's words. I would tentatively pro-offer the notion that Gebser speaks more from the space of vision image and less so from vision logic. The density, thickness, and profundity of Gebserian thought on the various mutations of consciousness and their expression in architecture, art, drama, literature is astounding. It is as astounding as Wilber's meta-theoretical lens and ability to weave practices from psychology, mystical traditions, hermeneutics, systems theory, and behavioral science. The two are, however, very distinct readings of history, each with their associated strengths and weaknesses. Both are deep integrations, yet their integrations are very distinct from one another. One vision image, the other vision logic. By failing to emphasize vision image at least as equally as vision logic, Wilber's integral loses touch with a potential doorway into a full experience and reading of aesthetics, culture, and history. With a more left-brain bias of vision logic, the include side of transcendent include often is missing. The vision image, right-brained, integral tradition, by and large, I believe, has a greater capacity in that regard. So, what Dierkes is arguing for, and what Ken Wilber initially said, was that the centauric actually provides a foundation for enlightenment to unfold with the body-mind integration and the experience of this vision image. That was kind of his larger argument. Freya Matthew explains ontopoetics this way, which was another one of those key terms that I want to kind of use interchangeably here for this kind of performative writing, or the kind of poetics that I'm describing. To find the world hidden within the world, and in the Taoist tradition she describes it as Leon, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, is to experience an opening of the ordinary world into poetic significance. So it requires a poetic sensibility, a sort of poetic consciousness to enter into it. But we might ask, what activates the poetic order? How can one slip under the skin of the world into that streaming that opens up in the midst of the phenomena and carries one from one poetic conjunction of circumstances to another? There are no doubt various techniques and strategies for entering this state, including Taoist arts such as feng shui, tai chi, calligraphy, and ritual dances that include a suspension of discursive thought and an alignment with the flow of energic streaming. Sometimes this shift might even occur spontaneously, or as a result of spontaneous lapses into dreamlike or meditative states. But it seems that the poetic order may also be fairly reliably activated by invocation, story, told, or better still enacted, with invocational intent. Perhaps this is what happened at Hamilton Downs, out of the stories that were told in the early phases of the event. By Indigenous custodians and colloquium participants alike, a rich narrative context was created. This then provided the poetic terms of reference for the world's own poetic interjections. So part of her experiment with the world to enact this kind of poetic consciousness in multiple dimensions was to enter the outback with a group of people. So she entered with an integral graduate student, a Taoist, a shaman, and each was invited to enter the world, enter to the inside using the mystical practices of their traditions. And part of where all of this interest and these convergences, what draws me to them is my own experience studying with a rabbi, Mark Goffney, who's a Kabbalistic lineage holder, who talks a lot about the inside of the inside as the place from which this kind of revealed writing or this conversation, with consciousness unfolds. And so just seeing these things come together, seeing the way it plays out, this is, I think, a multidimensional type of poetry, life in a more poetic way. I'm going to actually probably have to move a little faster here. And so I'm going to skip over a few things. Another convergence point for me was a course here at CIIS, where I used to work until this fall, for about a year and a half. The Poetics of Praxis is the refinement of experience. This is a quote from Stephen Goodman, who taught a Poetics of Enlightenment course here in the Asian Comparative Studies department. And in that class, we looked at the same thread of writing and revelation. And we studied it in the Mahasiddhas, and we studied the Dohas of Saraha. We looked into Jane Hirschfield and her poetics, and just really looked for similarities amongst these many different poetic ways of knowing. And one of the other threads that I want to presence today is the role of the body through the felt sense in this process. So the felt sense, to give you a very brief definition, and there's a longer version on your handout of felt sense writing as a process, but a felt sense is not just an emotion. Fear, anger, joy, sadness, these are emotions. A felt sense is different. It is a bodily quality like heavy, sticky, jumpy, fluttery, tight. A felt sense is unmistakably meaningful, and yet we don't know what it is. And going back to the sense of the vision image that is communicating something through the field of your awareness or through your body's energies, a felt sense can be shifted. when you bring it into awareness. And actually the shifting of the felt sense and the ability to engage this multisensory sort of awareness is one of the hugest predictors of success in psychotherapy. And Jinlin, who's the creator of this, and most of his work is available on focusing.org, he's a phenomenologist and a psychologist in the depth psychology tradition, and a writer in other ways too. He also has two other technologies that I wanted to make you aware of. Thinking at the Edge, which is a technology for using words to peer over into what wants to be said or what wants to be created and bring it into manifestation. And so it's sort of a prophetic unfolding technique. And his other technology, or his other way of describing this is in his new phenomenology of carrying forward, which is about finding implicit intricacies, which is part of the picture that I'm wanting to build here, using the body-mind integration and sort of the taste of the experience of composing. The implicit intricacies are the things that writers, whether they're poets or philosophers, are all working with, and they're seeking to carry them forward into meaning, and they can never be completely approximated or completely described or captured. So there's always this sense of something left to be said, the unfinished. And to enter into that kind of a realm of the unfinished kind of opens up a little bit of that feeling of chaos that is part of the system. And that's where Jinlin's technique, it's useful in many different realms, but I use it consistently in my writing. To sense, part of the questions for the technique are, is this complete? Is there something missing? And so you use that felt sense of the body to actually approximate what's there and what's deficient. Okay, more than I'm gonna skip over here. Okay, so does anyone here know George Quash's work? George Quash's work? Not familiar with him? Okay. Stephen Goodman's good friend with him here. He came and spoke to our poetics class that I mentioned. But his book, Axial Stones, is one that I'm going to read a little bit to you from to illustrate yet another technique here, kind of related to the axial. He calls it axial poetics. And he's inspired, particularly, by Tawil in the, creative imagination work of Henri Corbin, that's been mentioned a few times. He was good friends with Robert Kelly, the poet, and Charles Stein, and he did some work with Gary Hill. I'm just mentioning some of the names of people, and Jerome Rothenberg. So those are his collaborators, who also use similar poetics that they've kind of created together. There was a very collaborative aesthetic that emerged through their experiments, and their experiments are very consciousness-based. But the zero set is where he begins to unfold a little bit about principle-driven art and describes the axial. So I think this is a useful technology, and I offer it to you so that you might consider it yourself. What might it mean to write from an axial place? So I'm going to read a little longer passage and show you some of the images as I read. I say that the axial is a principle, and that it embodies a primary or first truth, which is there before any of its uses or circumstantial appearances and applications. Or to say it in keeping with its axiality, the axial stands in its event before itself. Perhaps calling it a principle is a way of saying that it has no category. I like to think this because it means to me, as a poet, that it belongs to the realm of poetics in the sense of the necessary provisional. And I understand this provisional state to be the open domain of non-definitive saying that performs what it addresses, the performative indicative. So I can say the axial comprises a zero set, and that it is not a member of its own set. Yet that set, which is defined by the existence of the axial, but of which the axial cannot itself be a member, is necessary for its principle to inhere. Hence its double nature, essential and impossible. If nothing else, thinking in this way about the axial helps sustain the attitude needed to do the crazy work that comes out of the axial state, essential and impossible things. And he cites the stones as an example of these essential and impossible things. He would pick up boulders that he felt were somehow magnetized to one another, and inside, as he placed them into relationship to feel what the conversation was that they were having, he would find the moment at which they would balance. But he would find it internally. He would feel it snap into place. And so that's how his axial poetics works also. So whether it's stones or words, that's an expression of the axial. So axial stones float freely in the time of viewing, as the thought of it floats freely in this time of saying, and carries further to an edge of itself. The axial statement is an example of itself, an axial event at the level of poetics, a reflexive act of speaking that unpacks the word itself, as well as the more abstract notion of the word itself. Anything said, any indication has consequences. They range from grave, as in gravity, to lightened, lifting, even uplifting, as in levity. The latter may be seen as expressing a further consequence of release, precipitated by a principle surrendered to gravity through an open axis. His definition is beauty equals precarious times the optimal. Beauty equals precarious times optimal. And that longer passage plus a little more is actually on your handout. So if you wanted to come back to it, you'll have it. Then also from George Quasha, I took another very useful, I think, technology of writing. What I'm thinking of is potentially integral writing, though there are many ways to look at integral writing. And in my role here as director of the Writing Center, we got to explore a few through Sri Aurobindo and the mother's lenses, and some of their arguments about writing, since writing was a yoga that Sri Aurobindo engaged in daily. I believe he remarked, though, he had sort of Sri Aurobindo had more of an opinion that his writing was reality as opposed to describing reality, which he thought the transcendental poets did. So there are some distinctions, I think, here that we could maybe tease apart more around the aesthetics of integral writing. But another technology here is the preverb. And George Quasha did a series of books called Preverbs, or in the Preverb series. This one's called Glossodalia Attract, a word he created. And he says of this that every line in the book is its own time journey. It's also a hole in time, something like a rabbit hole into the atemporal. Perhaps poetry is, at least for the poet, the most active threshold between time and no time. I think of a preverb as what gets me there in no time. It's the when-where allowing singularity to appear. So, to give you a sense of what a preverb is, these are also on your handout, so you can see it a little more clearly. They do each kind of contain a trickster sort of quality to them. They will elude your reading and rereading.
Are there more handouts?
There are, yeah. So each line kind of reads its own poem, or the page might read as a poem, and it depends on the question you bring to the book, sort of like an intentional bibliomancy. So it's written from the place of bibliomancy for the practice of bibliomancy, through the oracle, and we might say the oracle of the heart. The principle is if you know, you know. Declaring so presumes true things get a little early notice. It's long, it's kind of hard for me to read this here, maybe easier on your handout. It's long known there's no sexual balance, but only precarious rectification now. I precisely cannot tell you how open I am, meaning no lines link in the end, all lines do from the beginning. So I could go on, but my sense of these is that they don't satisfy beginning to end, or out of the time at which the question was asked. And so they're sort of like, speak to you from the place at which you are. And I think it's kind of a genius technique and an interesting argument. Did everyone get a handout who needed one? Okay, so another part that I said I would try today is to define a grammar of the world statement. And this is not so much, this is sort of like a projective or a playful quasha preverb type playing. And I'm calling it sacramental poetic bodies. To invoke or think about the inner and outer relationship that we find inherent in a sacrament. Poetics is a preverbal sacrament, all being informed. The world turns on the pure statement. The world statement is composed of nosemes, the smallest unit of Gnostic meaning. We might think of these as implicit intricacies, seed ideas, or we might not think of them at all, but rather ingest them as we create, like the psychoactive unfoldings of space-time that become our art of living. The nosemes are arranged according to stasis, by which we allow a healthy dose of the discordant and chaotic dangers to enter our systems of knowing. The disorder lends the quality of wholeness to the work, allows failure to take its place alongside success in the greater verity. Let them inform one another and engage the dialogue beyond dialectic. This is like the level of a sentence or paragraph organized by felt sense of what's missing and what's more complete. We must open our minds to dissolve the ego's control of what gets said to whom and in what order, in what orderly fashion, and let the speaking speak so the hearing can hear. This is world, a real statement as such. No representation. How are the world statements arranged so that no representation is present in the word bodies that so often, but not always, carry our meanings? It is arranged by intensities of touch, feel, flow, fullness, sensing. It is composed using all the senses, which at their deepest level are one sense with two core ingredients, the breath and knowing. A statement has life and energy flowing through it. It can't help but create before it is written, to touch the nosemes beckoning it to the surface of this now conversation, held with hearts open, falling through love windows of meaning, believing, trusting, being one moment to the next, always now. That is its tense. It occurs or ripens, is infused or alchemized so that it can be heard as utterance from the soul of the world, the interior of culture, uttering its cry of rebellion over and over as it comes to know ourselves living it. When a statement is formed, a world lies open at its feet, ready to be aware, seen in its wholing that moves towards whole filling, never to reach the one word that would release it as this all as it becomes. How do you know you have uttered a statement? You move as the exuberant blossoming of all you notice, all you are. You ask a question, turn to a page. Lean in, listen, look, let love flower your perception into the grammar of fullness as you write, create, exist. Your attention might be its utterance, your sigh its release, preverbal signs that dissolve us into we from me, he, they, she, is a magic word, the world turned inside out, the world inside the world, the truth untamed. Sometimes we compose or utter a world statement by dance, healing, sensing semiotics, yoga, asana, or touch. Sometimes or always the statement composes us axially. This poetics is a topology of being, and the mountains fill the contours of our study and maps, our territories as yet not crossed. This study of the world's sentence structure is called Eteology. This is a post-philosophical awareing of truth. Within this poetics, what is the compass? The yes that says, pause and right here, dip deeper into the waters, the forgetting, to find the here from which we can only move on from, with greater urgency, at least having discovered what blocks are for, or how bodies birth being into becoming. A reverie, memory, time, a tree, if you like, opening in the middle of your body. Okay, so I think I'm at time, and I just wanted to quickly presence, or getting close to time so I can allow some questions. the three traditions that I said I would be able to also weave in, and I could honestly use a little more time, I think, to create a better sense of wholeness with it. But I'll just mention here what's significant about each one. So, unique self-prophecy in the Kabbalistic hermeneutics, and I'm thinking here of like work by Elliot Wolfson, his ambitious tome. If you haven't heard of it and you're interested in poetry, you might find it interesting. Language, eros being Kabbalistic hermeneutics and poetic imagination, which are his core loves, and he brought them into a single book. It's a very good, interesting book. But essentially, unique self-prophecy comes from Mark Goffney, who worked with the tradition of evolutionary Kabbalah and made an argument based on the Jacob moment from Mordecai Linier's work, that in order to enter into the prophetic moment, you actually have to access unique essence that speaks through the word. And so there's a whole technique here that could be unfolded, and I believe I gave you a passage on your handouts that talks about the Shrina, that is the I who speaks, as the moment of the prophetic, and talks a little bit about the different kinds of Zodic. Moses was in this particular schema, was a true self prophet who spoke from, not from unique positioning. And the argument of Lanier is that all the other prophets spoke from their unique essence interaction with the world and the word. And so then I would also mention the Sufism, the Sufi tradition that has come up multiple times, really popularized by Henri Corbin. James Hillman's Thought of the World and Soul of the Heart is a great introduction. He was deeply influenced. And Tom Cheatham's work on this as well. And then Charles Olson is someone I'm working with now because of the centrality of his influence in the experimental writing program at Naropa, where I'm studying. He uses projective verse, which is a depth psychology really influenced by Jung. It's involves anima and animus, involves projection onto the word of essences. And it also has a certain intensity that you'll see if you look at the passage from Olson on your handout. There's a sense of not stopping, letting one energy lead to the next, trusting what's coming, following the unfolding. And what results is often a difficult text to read. It requires some being on the inside of it as well. And so I just leave you with those technologies. I've tried to render a little bit more transparent about process, including my own from today, offering a lineage of influences as a start and a supplemental handout. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions?
Just curious, you mentioned Aurobindo writing in this way, how it together, how it didn't describe reality. What?
Okay.
I like to do, I have to think of poetry myself as something that evokes reality, evokes what it, not just describes it, evokes into being what it says. It's just magical. Can you elaborate more on, or just think of that sort of that aspect of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can elaborate on it, although this was a text cited to me by a friend, and so I haven't read the original of Aurobindo's statement. But I do know a little bit from studying Savitri, which is his epic poem, for those of you who know it. Okay, so what that means to me, I guess, is really the best answer I can respond with, is that writing that becomes the world or is the world, and it moves beyond aesthetics or moves beyond art in a sense, must come from an perspectival place, and it also gives a transmission. And I don't know really, I'm interested in the theory of transmission, like how does language do this magical thing that is yet outside of time? So, when spiritual teachers give a transmission, it's been described to me that subtle awareness is very helpful. That teacher needs to have a very firm grasp of the subtle in order to be able to really fully use their gifts of giving a transmission. So I think in the same way, full use of the magic and the mythic, access to these as forms of play of the world, and then entering the consciousness to sort of illuminate it.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get too out there. But
When I said magic, I didn't mean in the Gebser sense, so much more in just the cultural sense.
Oh yeah.
You say words and the reality happens.
Yeah. Especially if you're at Jinlin's edge, right, of carrying forward, where you're trying very much to sense through the felt sense what wants to come or be birthed into statement. And then in that sense, yeah, you're kind of helping birth reality at the same time. It's a midwifing practice.
Yeah.
I think Jeremy has his hand up. And then
Are you familiar with Jeffrey Kripal's work in Authors of the Impossible, where he's making a similar kind of argument that reality itself is hermeneutical, and so language and word and world are kind of all sort of flowing into each other. But in his case, he's taking the example of artists and writers who seem to write themselves into their own stories because of strange things that happen in their lives. I made a connection with the prophetic elements that you were mentioning.
Oh yeah. Interesting. Okay. I'll have to check that out. Thank you. Let me get that reference from you later. I know Kripal's work.
There's a correlation with that and sigil magic.
Yes.
And also sigil magic could be looked at as a spontaneous generation of seed syllables and then enacting them in reality.
See that.
You see kind of a melange of thought here.
Yeah.
And I would say for Gebser to go to that which is atemporal, right, and dwell there. But also there are problems with transmission and mediation, so look for the unmediated maybe. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. So look for the unmediated. Is that something you could unfold a little bit more?
Well, I think when you come to a spiritual teacher, originally you see the teacher as a transmission point, right? But my sense is that eventually it's just the being present. And the teacher is just there, I don't know, as a beacon. Kind of like, oh, there's something here. Just be present, and life will unfold, and it will be poetic.
Yeah.
Because when you're in that region, it is scary, that beautiful scary. That's the edge, right? Riding the edge. That's Mindell, too. It's not going over the edge, but riding it. But not forward, because that's directional. But just being present, atemporal. And I love some of the things you did here. I'm going to do some practice dialogue, I think, and journaling about Gebser at the conference.
Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to know more too about, I've done some looking into syneresis and cystasis and how this kind of expresses that. And I'd like more conversation on that and its relationship to Gebser's thought. Michael, would you have a hand up?
I should send you my PowerPoint, because I'm sorry.
No,
I like that too.
Yeah, I don't know where to put it, but just because I started out looking at the integral and Berishan and all with syneresis and cystasis, and they're just too abstract. And so if you look at the talk, you see that I wound up in a kind of a heart place where you're talking about a Sufi kind of core. Yeah.
I wanted to follow on the idea of the connection between poetry and magic. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and one of the joys of being a dad at this stage of her life is that I'm able to begin reading books, like fantasy books to her. So we read The Last Unicorn, and we just read the first Harry Potter book. And they both involve magic. They both involve wizards and witches who, in order to manifest a reality, to make something happen, to save the unicorn, or to cast a spell on the kid you don't like, in the case of Hogwarts, you have to say the right words, the exact right words, and you have to say them the exact right way. The emphasis, the intention, all that has to be present. And as a person who writes poetry as well, I know that that's exactly what happens in poetry, and the poetry works only when the words are correct, the delivery is correct, the projection is correct, and the transmission occurs. And that allows, I think, the poetry to be a world creating, a world disclosing, or a world revealing act, and a magical act. And so I think part of what one of the strands of your presentation here is to evoke those connections between really how language is effective, how language is efficient in the world. And there are other connections too, like in Heidegger, for example, he really draws a very close relationship between poetry and being, and the kind of originary world-disclosing act as a poetic act, as one that doesn't have a ground in just kind of correspondence as a description, but is actually kind of an enactment, a disclosed, a sort of a creative act, right? So that would be an interesting thread to weave into or wand to weave into your flexible ball of thought here.
Great. No, thank you, Marco. It's nice to have your voice on that. And I think what I most want to respond to from what you were kind of creating is the Heidegger piece and the sense just kind of adding, and he has this sense of language as concealing, but then there's like a necessary, a revealing or unconcealing, but then there's like a necessary concealment that's always going on at the same time. And so that's also part of this like uttering of, or having this conversation essentially with the world, I think too, is the poetry inheres through the contact with the form, at the same time as like the diaphaneity is maybe being revealed.
Corban read Heidegger and translated some of his works, and I do remember him saying something similar about sort of the poetics and the image being sort of the only way to work with reality is through image. So we can't escape it. We can't have, get out of our own imagination, but at the same time it can be sort of translucent.
Nice, yeah. And that's the soul. Hillman says that the soul, dreams and images, essentially. So that's a common thread that I think we're also seeing come through here. But good reference. I'll have to look into that one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.